What if the most powerful kings in history were also the most troubled souls of their time? Throughout the ages, absolute power has created some of the most fascinating and disturbing characters to ever wear a crown. Tonight, we journey through history to explore 11 monarchs whose personal habits and behaviors shocked even their own courts and subjects. From ancient empires to medieval kingdoms, these rulers wielded immense power while harboring secrets that would chill the blood of ordinary mortals. Power, as they say, corrupts absolutely, and in the hands of these 11 kings, it created behaviors so extreme, so disturbing, that they became legends whispered in palace corridors for centuries to come. Some were worshipped as gods, others feared as demons, but all of them left an indelible mark on history through their peculiar and often horrifying personal habits. As we explore their stories tonight, we'll discover how unlimited authority can transform human nature in the most unexpected ways. The line between genius and madness has always been thin, particularly when it comes to those born to rule. These kings lived in a world where their every whim could become reality, where no one dared to question their behavior, no matter how strange or disturbing it might seem. In this rarefied atmosphere of absolute power, normal human constraints simply didn't apply, leading to the development of habits and practices that would seem impossible in any other context. Let us begin our journey with King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, who ruled from 605. This mighty king, famous for his hanging gardens and his conquest of Jerusalem, developed one of the most bizarre habits in royal history. According to ancient texts, Nebuchadnezzar began to believe he was not human at all, but rather a wild animal. Historical accounts describe how he would spend months at a time crawling on all fours through his palace gardens, eating grass like cattle, allowing his hair and nails to grow wild and untamed. This transformation didn't happen overnight, but rather developed gradually as Nebuchadnezzar's grip on reality began to slip. Court records suggest that his advisors initially tried to dismiss these episodes as temporary fits of madness, hoping the king would return to normal behavior. However, as months turned to years, it became clear that this was no temporary condition. The once mighty ruler of Babylon would be found in the early morning hours, dew-covered and wild-eyed, grazing in the royal gardens like a common beast of the field. What makes Nebuchadnezzar's case particularly disturbing is how his courtiers adapted to accommodate his bizarre behavior. Rather than attempting to restrain or treat their king, they simply worked around his animalistic episodes. When important state business needed to be conducted, they would wait for his more lucid moments, or conduct affairs through intermediaries. The mighty Babylonian Empire continued to function, albeit in the most unusual circumstances imaginable. The king's physical transformation was said to be as dramatic as his behavioral changes. Descriptions from the period paint a picture of a once regal monarch, reduced to a creature barely recognizable as human. His fingernails grew long and curved like eagle talons, while his hair became matted and wild, resembling the feathers of a great bird. His skin, once pampered with the finest oils and treatments, became weathered and coarse from his constant exposure to the elements as he lived like an animal in his own garden. Moving through the corridors of time, we encounter Emperor Caligula of Rome, whose reign from 37 to 41 CE was marked by increasingly erratic and disturbing behavior. Among his many unusual habits was his practice of conducting lengthy conversations with the moon, whom he believed to be his divine lover. Palace guards would often find the emperor standing alone on his balcony in the dead of night, gesturing animatedly and speaking passionately to the lunar orb hanging in the Roman sky. These nocturnal conversations with the moon were not brief affairs, but could last for hours at a time. Caligula would address Luna, the Roman moon goddess, as if she were physically present, asking for her advice on matters of state, professing his love, and sometimes becoming violently angry if he felt she wasn't responding appropriately to his advances. The emperor truly believed that the moon would descend from the heavens to spend intimate moments with him, and he would prepare elaborate bedchambers with the finest silk sheets and golden decorations for these imaginary encounters. What made this habit particularly disturbing to his subjects was how Caligula's lunar obsession began to influence his governance of the Roman Empire. He would postpone important military campaigns if the moon wasn't in the proper phase, and he made several crucial political decisions based on what he claimed the moon had whispered to him during their nighttime rendezvous. Roman senators learned to schedule important meetings and proposals around the emperor's lunar calendar, knowing that his mood and receptiveness to ideas would depend entirely on how he felt his celestial romance was progressing. The emperor's servants were instructed to prepare for these lunar visits with the same seriousness as they would for any earthly dignitary. They would lay out the finest foods, light hundreds of candles, and ensure that Caligula's chambers were arranged perfectly for his divine guest. When morning came and the moon had obviously failed to appear in physical form, Caligula would sometimes fly into violent rages, convinced that political enemies had somehow interfered with his lover's ability to visit him. Our journey through disturbing royal habits brings us next to King Charles VII of France, known as Charles the Mad, who ruled from 1380 to 1422. Among his many troubling behaviors was his absolute conviction that he was made of glass and could shatter at the slightest touch. This delusion led to one of the most bizarre royal protection protocols in European history, as the French court had to completely restructure palace life around their fragile king's imaginary condition. Charles would spend days at a time standing perfectly still, afraid that any movement might cause his glass body to crack or break completely. He insisted that iron rods be sewn into his clothing to provide structural support for his supposedly brittle frame. The king refused to allow anyone to touch him, even his own family members, convinced that the slightest contact would cause him to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Palace servants had to approach him with extreme caution, speaking in whispers and moving with deliberate slowness to avoid startling their delicate monarch. The practical implications of Charles's glass delusion were staggering for the French court. State ceremonies had to be completely redesigned to accommodate a king who couldn't shake hands, embrace visiting dignitaries, or participate in any of the traditional physical aspects of royal protocol. His throne was padded with thick cushions and surrounded by layers of soft fabric to protect him from any accidental impacts. Even the floors around his regular sitting and standing areas were covered with thick carpets and pillows. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how Charles's delusion affected his relationship with his own children and wife. He would weep inconsolably when they approached, terrified that their love and desire for physical affection would literally destroy him. His wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, learned to communicate with her husband from across large rooms, never coming close enough to accidentally brush against his supposedly glass form. The royal children grew up essentially fatherless, as Charles couldn't risk the physical contact that normal parent-child relationships require. The French court physicians and advisors tried everything to cure their king of his glass delusion, from elaborate magical rituals to early forms of what we might recognize as psychological therapy. They arranged for demonstrations where objects made of real glass were deliberately broken in front of Charles, hoping to show him that he had not suffered the same fate. They brought in expert glassmakers to explain the properties of glass and how different it was from human flesh and bone. Nothing worked, and Charles remained convinced of his fragile, transparent nature until his death. In the distant lands of ancient Persia, we encounter King Cambyses II, who ruled from 530 to 522 BCE, and developed perhaps one of the most macabre dining habits in royal history. This Persian monarch became obsessed with the idea that consuming human flesh would grant him immortality and divine powers. What began as an experimental taste during a particularly brutal military campaign gradually evolved into a regular dining preference that horrified even his most loyal supporters. Cambyses didn't simply consume human flesh randomly, but rather developed elaborate rituals around his cannibalistic practices. He believed that different parts of the human body would grant him different powers and ability. According to Persian historians, he thought that eating the hearts of brave warriors would increase his courage in battle, while consuming the brains of wise advisors would enhance his intelligence and decision-making abilities. The king established a careful system for selecting his victims, often choosing prisoners of war who had displayed particular qualities he wished to possess. The preparation of these ghastly meals became a dark art within the Persian court. Cambyses employed special cooks who were sworn to secrecy and trained in the specific methods the king believed would maximize the transfer of power from the consumed to the consumer. These meals were prepared with the same care and attention to detail as any royal feast, complete with exotic spices and elaborate presentation. The king would dine alone during these sessions, believing that sharing the meal would dilute the power he hoped to gain. What made Cambyses' cannibalistic habits particularly disturbing was how methodical and rational he believed them to be. This wasn't the random violence of a madman, but rather the calculated behavior of someone who genuinely believed he was following a logical path to divine power. He kept detailed records of his meals, noting which body parts he had consumed and what effects he believed they had produced. Court scribes were forced to maintain these gruesome logs, documenting the king's descent into what we would now clearly recognize as severe mental illness. The psychological impact on Cambyses' court was devastating. Nobles lived in constant fear that they might be selected for the king's next meal, leading to an atmosphere of paranoia and terror that paralyzed the Persian government. Military commanders and advisors began avoiding the king's presence whenever possible, afraid that displaying any admirable qualities might mark them as desirable additions to the royal menu. The once mighty Persian court became a place where excellence and virtue were hidden rather than celebrated. Our exploration of royal madness takes us next to King Christian VII of Denmark, who ruled from 1766 to 1808 and developed an obsession with physical self-harm that shocked European courts. Christian believed that pain would purify his soul and bring him closer to divine enlightenment, leading him to engage in increasingly severe forms of self-inflicted injury. What began as simple acts of penance gradually evolved into elaborate torture sessions that the king would perform on himself with religious fervor. Christian's self-harm rituals followed a complex schedule that he believed corresponded to religious calendar events and astrological alignment. On certain holy days he would use specially designed implements to create precise cuts and wounds on his body, believing that the blood he shed would wash away his sins and the sins of his subjects. The king commissioned skilled craftsmen to create increasingly sophisticated tools for these sessions, treating his self-torture implements with the same reverence that other monarchs might show toward crown jewels or religious relics. The Danish court physicians were horrified by their king's practices, but found themselves powerless to intervene. Christian had convinced himself that any attempt to prevent his self-harm was actually an attempt to interfere with his spiritual development and his relationship with God. He would fly into violent rages if anyone tried to hide his tools or bandage his wounds before he believed the proper amount of blood had been shed. Court doctors learned to wait at a fetric distance, with medical supplies, ready to treat the king only after he had completed what he saw as his sacred duty. Perhaps most disturbing was how Christian attempted to involve his courtiers and family members in his self-harm practices. He would sometimes insist that witnessing his suffering was a privilege that would bring spiritual benefits to the observers. Royal ceremonies and state dinners would occasionally be interrupted by the king's sudden decision that the moment required a purification ritual. Guests would be forced to watch in horrified silence as their monarch carved symbols into his flesh or beat himself with specially designed whips. The international implications of Christian's behavior were severe for Denmark's diplomatic relations. Foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries never knew when a routine court function might devolve into a disturbing display of royal self-mutilation. Several important trade negotiations were abandoned when potential partners decided they couldn't conduct business with a monarch whose behavior was so unpredictable and disturbing. Denmark's reputation in European courts suffered tremendously as word of the king's habits spread throughout the continent. From the cold reaches of Scandinavia, we traveled to medieval England to examine King Henry VI, whose reign from 1422 to 1461 and again from 1470 to 1471 was marked by his disturbing habit of falling into catatonic states that could last for months at a time. During these episodes, Henry would become completely unresponsive to the world around him, sitting motionless with his eyes open but seeing nothing. creating one of the most unsettling spectacles in English royal history. These catatonic episodes weren't brief moments of distraction, but rather complete withdrawals from reality that left the king essentially absent from his own body. Palace servants would dress him, move him from room to room, and even feed him by carefully placing small amounts of food in his mouth, all while Henry remained as still and unresponsive as a statue. His eyes would remain open throughout these episodes, leading many observers to believe that he was somehow conscious, but trapped within his own mind, fully aware of his surroundings, but unable to respond or communicate. The English court developed elaborate protocols for managing their catatonic king during these episodes. Important documents requiring the royal seal would be signed by carefully guiding Henry's hand, while he remained in his trance-like state. State ceremonies would proceed with the king present, but completely inactive, creating surreal scenes where hundreds of nobles would bow and pay homage to a monarch who showed no sign of acknowledging their presence. Foreign ambassadors reported feeling deeply unsettled by audiences with a king who would stare straight ahead without blinking or speaking throughout entire diplomatic meetings. What made Henry's condition particularly disturbing was the unpredictability of these episodes. The king might be conducting normal royal business one moment, engaged in conversation and making decisions, only to suddenly freeze mid-sentence and retreat into his catatonic state. There was no warning, and no apparent trigger that courtiers could identify. This unpredictability created a constant state of anxiety within the English court, as no one ever knew when their monarch might simply stop functioning as a human being. The political implications of Henry's condition were devastating for England. During a crucial period in its history, the ongoing Wars of the Roses required strong royal leadership, but instead, the country was often effectively ruled by regents and advisors, while their king sat motionless in his chambers. Military campaigns had to be planned and executed without royal input, and crucial diplomatic negotiations were conducted by representatives who could never be certain whether the king would be capable of honoring any agreements they might reach. Our journey through the darkest corners of royal behavior brings us to King Eric XIV of Sweden, who ruled from 1560 to 1568, and developed an obsession with poison that consumed his daily life. Eric became convinced that enemies were constantly attempting to poison him, leading him to develop elaborate food testing rituals that turned every meal into a lengthy and disturbing ceremony. What began as reasonable royal precautions gradually evolved into paranoid behaviors that dominated every aspect of his existence. Eric's anti-poison protocols were extraordinarily complex and time-intensive. Every piece of food that entered the royal kitchens had to be tested by multiple servants before it could be prepared for the king's consumption. The testing process itself was a gruesome affair, as Eric insisted that the testers consume large enough portions to ensure that slow-acting poisons would be detected. Several servants died during these testing sessions, though whether from actual poison or from the stress and fear of their position remains unclear from historical records. The Swedish king's paranoia about poison extended far beyond his meals to include virtually every object in his environment. He insisted that his clothing, furniture, books, and even the air in his chambers be somehow purified or tested before he would expose himself to them. Servants were required to taste the ink in his pens, the wax on his seals, and even the soap used to clean his body. The royal chambers became a sterile environment, where nothing could be introduced without extensive testing and purification rituals. Perhaps most disturbing was Eric's treatment of suspected poisoners, real or imagined. Anyone who had any contact with the king's food, drink, or personal items could suddenly find themselves accused of attempted murder. The punishments for these alleged poisoning attempts were severe and public, serving as both warning and entertainment for Eric's subject. Torture sessions designed to extract confessions became regular features of court life, with the king often personally participating in the interrogation of suspected would-be assassins. The psychological toll of Eric's poison obsession was severe, not only for the king himself, but for everyone around him. Court life became a nightmare of constant suspicion and fear, where a simple gesture like handing the king a document could result in accusations of attempted murder. The Swedish nobility began avoiding court functions whenever possible, afraid that any interaction with their paranoid monarch might result in torture, execution, or both. Eric's poison paranoia eventually contributed to his own downfall, as his behavior became so erratic and dangerous that his own brothers felt compelled to overthrow him. In the sun-scorched deserts of ancient Egypt, we encounter Pharaoh Akhenaten, who ruled from 1353 to 1336 BCE, and developed the disturbing habit of mummifying himself while still alive. This revolutionary pharaoh, known for his religious reforms and his unusual artistic representations, became obsessed with the mummification process, and began subjecting himself to increasingly elaborate preservation rituals while he remained breathing and conscious. Akhenaten's living mummification practices began with simple experiments in preserving parts of his body. He would have court embalmers wrap individual limbs in preservation cloths, and apply mummification chemicals to small areas of his skin, believing that beginning the preservation process while alive would ensure a more perfect afterlife existence. Gradually, these experiments expanded to include larger portions of his body, creating the horrifying spectacle of a living pharaoh, partially wrapped like a corpse. The religious reasoning behind Akhenaten's self-mummification was complex, and tied to his revolutionary changes to Egyptian religion. He believed that by beginning the mummification process while his soul was still present in his body, he could maintain consciousness throughout the preservation process, and enter the afterlife as a fully aware and powerful deity. The pharaoh saw his living mummification as the ultimate expression of his divine nature and his rejection of traditional Egyptian death and preservation customs. Court embalmers were forced to develop entirely new techniques to accommodate their living pharaoh's unusual requests. Traditional mummification involved the removal of organs and the complete desiccation of body tissues, processes that were obviously impossible to perform on a living person. Instead, they had to create modified preservation methods that would satisfy Akhenaten's religious beliefs, while keeping him alive and functional as a ruler. These techniques involved the application of preservation chemicals to the skin surface and the wrapping of body parts in specially treated linens. The visual impact of Akhenaten's partial mummification was profoundly disturbing to his subjects and court officials. State ceremonies and religious rituals would feature a pharaoh who was partially wrapped in burial cloth, with portions of his skin treated with the same chemicals used on corpses. The smell of preservation spices and embalming fluids would permeate the royal presence, creating an atmosphere that was part royal court and part funeral parlor. Foreign diplomats reported being deeply unsettled by meetings with a pharaoh who looked and smelled like he was already dead. From ancient Egypt, we travel to medieval Wallachia to examine Vlad III, known as Vlad the Impaler, who ruled from 1448 to 1476, and developed one of history's most notorious disturbing habits: dining surrounded by his impaled victims while they slowly died in agony. This practice went far beyond simple cruelty and evolved into an elaborate ritual that Vlad genuinely seemed to enjoy, creating scenes of horror that shocked even the violence-hardened medieval world. Vlad's impalement dinners were carefully orchestrated events that combined royal dining with public execution in the most macabre way possible. The Wallachian prince would have his meals served on tables positioned strategically among forests of impaled victims, allowing him to watch their suffering while he enjoyed elaborate feasts. These weren't quick executions, but rather slow death spectacles that could last for hours or even days, providing Vlad with extended entertainment during his meal times. The logistics of Vlad's impalement dining required extensive preparation and coordination. Servants had to time the executions precisely so that victims would be at the peak of their suffering during meal service. The impalement stakes had to be positioned at the correct heights and angles to provide optimal viewing for the prince while he ate. Special dining furniture was designed to allow Vlad to recline comfortably while maintaining clear sight lines to his dying victims. What made Vlad's habits particularly disturbing was his apparent genuine enjoyment of the combination of fine dining and human suffering. Historical accounts describe him laughing and making jokes while prisoners writhed in agony just a few feet from his dining table. He would sometimes pause between courses to walk among the impaled victims, offering mocking comments about their situation or making suggestions for how they might position themselves to die more entertainingly. The psychological impact of these impalement dinners extended far beyond Vlad's immediate victims to affect his entire court and population. Servants who were required to serve meals during these events often developed lasting psychological trauma from the experience. The knowledge that their prince found human suffering entertaining made even routine court functions feel dangerous and unpredictable. Vlad's subjects lived in constant fear that they might someday find themselves providing dinner entertainment for their ruler's twisted appetites. Our exploration of royal madness takes us next to King George III of Britain, whose reign from 1760 to 1820 was marked by his disturbing habit of speaking to trees and inanimate objects as if they were close personal friends and advisors. This behavior, which became increasingly pronounced as George aged, created some of the most surreal scenes in British royal history and contributed to the king's reputation for madness. George's conversations with trees weren't brief acknowledgments or simple eccentricities, but rather lengthy, detailed discussions about matters of state, personal relationships, and philosophical questions. Palace guards would discover the king in the royal gardens at all hours, engaged in animated conversations with oak trees, rose bushes, and ornamental shrubs. He would gesticulate wildly, raise his voice in apparent argument, and sometimes even appear to be taking notes based on advice he believed he was receiving from his plant companions. The king's belief in the consciousness and wisdom of trees extended to his governance of the British Empire. George would sometimes claim that important policy decisions had been suggested to him by particularly wise old oak trees in Windsor Great Park. He insisted that trees, having lived for centuries, possessed a deep understanding of history and politics that human advisors simply couldn't match. Court officials learned to work around their king's botanical consultations, sometimes delaying important decisions for days while George consulted his arboreal counsel. Perhaps most disturbing was how seriously George took these plant conversations, and how frustrated he would become when others couldn't hear the voices he claimed to be receiving. The king would become agitated and sometimes violent when courtiers failed to acknowledge the presence and wisdom of his plant advisors. He would insist that important trees be given formal titles and positions within the royal household, creating bizarre situations where palace protocol had to account for the imaginary participation of garden vegetation in state affairs. The impact of George's tree conversations on British court life was profound and lasting. Diplomatic functions held in garden settings became exercises in careful navigation, as foreign ambassadors had to pretend not to notice when their host suddenly began having animated discussions with nearby foliage. The king's habit of interrupting important meetings to consult with potted plants created delays and confusion in crucial government business during some of Britain's most challenging historical periods. Finally, we come to Emperor Justinian II of the Byzantine Empire, who ruled from 685 to 6095 and again from 705 to 711, and developed the deeply disturbing habit of collecting and wearing the severed noses of his enemies and political rivals. This macabre practice began during Justinian's exile, when his own nose had been cut off as punishment, and evolved into an obsession with nasal mutilation that defined his second reign. Justinian's nose collection wasn't simply a matter of battlefield trophies or symbols of victory, but rather an elaborate system of personal adornment that he genuinely believed enhanced his appearance and authority. The deposed emperor had skilled craftsmen create intricate jewelry and accessories using the preserved noses of his enemies, wearing them as necklaces, bracelets, and even incorporating them into his crown and royal regalia. He believed that wearing the noses of defeated foes would transfer their strength and cunning to him while serving as a constant reminder of his power over life and death. The process of nose collection became a formal ritual within Justinian's restored court. Enemies who were captured or defeated wouldn't simply be executed, but would first undergo the ceremonial removal of their noses in elaborate public ceremonies. The emperor would personally oversee these mutilation sessions, sometimes participating directly in the cut. The severed noses would then be preserved, using special techniques developed by court artisans and added to Justinian's ever-growing collection. What made this habit particularly disturbing was how Justinian integrated his nose collection into normal court functions and diplomatic activities. State dinners would feature the emperor wearing a necklace made from dozens of preserved human noses, while important treaties and agreements would be signed by a ruler whose crown was decorated with the facial features of former enemies. Foreign ambassadors reported being deeply unsettled by meetings with a monarch whose personal accessories included recognizable body parts from people they had known or worked with. The psychological impact of Justinian's nose obsession created a climate of terror throughout the Byzantine Empire. The knowledge that political opposition or military failure might result in facial mutilation rather than simple death created a new level of fear among the emperor's subjects. Court officials lived in constant awareness that their noses might someday become part of the imperial jewelry collection, leading to a paralysis of initiative and honest counsel that contributed to the empire's decline during Justinian's troubled reign. As we conclude our journey through these 11 tales of royal madness and disturbing habits, we're left to contemplate the strange relationship between absolute power and human psychology. Each of these monarchs possessed the ultimate authority over their subjects' lives and deaths, existing in a world where their every whim could become reality and their strangest desires could be indulged without consequence. In this rarefied atmosphere, normal human constraints and social pressures simply didn't apply. The stories we've explored tonight reveal how isolation, unchecked authority, and the burden of absolute responsibility can warp even the most privileged human mind. These kings lived in golden cages where flattery replaced honest counsel, where fear masqueraded as respect, and where the line between reality and delusion became increasingly blurred. Their disturbing habits weren't simply personal eccentricities, but rather symptoms of minds that had been fundamentally altered by the corrupting influence of unlimited power. Perhaps most troubling of all is how these royal aberrations were enabled and accommodated by the very systems designed to support monarchical rule. Courts adapted to accommodate glass kings and lunar lovers. Embalmers learned to mummify the living, and entire governmental systems learned to function around monarchs who had conversations with trees or fell into months-long catatonic states. The machinery of absolute monarchy proved remarkably flexible in its ability to work around even the most bizarre and disturbing royal behaviors. These 11 kings remind us that power without accountability, authority without oversight, and privilege without consequence can transform anyone into something monstrous. Their disturbing habits weren't inherent character flaws, but rather the natural result of placing fallible human beings in positions of unlimited authority. In their madness, we see reflected the dangers of any system that places individuals beyond the reach of normal human checks and balance. As we drift towards sleep, let these stories serve as both entertainment and warning. The crown jewels and royal regalia that we admire in museums today were once worn by human beings whose unchecked power had transformed them into creatures barely recognizable as. In their disturbing habits, we see the ultimate expression of what happens when human nature is freed from all constraints, all consequences, and all accountability. The next time you encounter stories of modern leaders or powerful individuals whose behavior seems increasingly erratic or disturbing, remember these 11 kings and their strange habits. Power, whether political, economic, or social, has always had the potential to corrupt and distort human nature. The only difference between then and now is the presence or absence of systems designed to limit and check the exercise of absolute authority. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be untroubled by visions of glass kings, lunar lovers, and monarchs who dined among their impaled enemies. These stories belong to history, but their lessons remain eternally relevant for anyone seeking to understand the complex relationship between power, authority, and human psychology. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing thing about these 11 kings isn't their individual habits, but rather how easily their subjects and courts adapted to accommodate behaviors that should have been recognized as symptoms of severe mental illness. The crowns have crumbled, the empires have fallen, and the disturbing kings who once terrorized their subjects have long since turned to dust, but their stories remain preserved in the pages of history as eternal reminders of what happens when human beings are granted the power of gods without the wisdom to use it responsibly. Sleep well, knowing that the age of absolute monarchy has passed, and that the disturbing habits of these 11 kings belong firmly in the realm of historical curiosity rather than contemporary reality. Yet the fascination with these royal aberrations continues to this day, drawing historians, psychologists, and curious minds into the dark corridors of palace life where madness and power dance their eternal waltz. Modern scholars have attempted to diagnose these ancient monarchs using contemporary understanding of mental health, suggesting that many of their disturbing habits might have been symptoms of conditions we now recognize and treat. But such retrospective analysis, while intellectually satisfying, cannot capture the full horror of living under the rule of these troubled souls. The courtiers who served these kings left behind memoirs and records that paint vivid pictures of life in the shadow of royal madness. Palace servants wrote of sleepless nights, of walking on eggshells around unpredictable monarchs, of witnessing acts so disturbing that they haunted dreams for years afterward. These first-hand accounts provide invaluable insights into how entire governmental systems learned to function around the peculiar limitations and dangerous obsessions of their rulers. Consider the economic implications of these royal habits, which often diverted enormous resources toward accommodating madness, rather than serving the needs of the kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar's animal episodes required teams of servants to monitor and protect him, while Charles VI's glass delusion necessitated the complete reconstruction of palace protocols and furnishings. The financial cost of royal madness was often measured not just in gold and silver, but in the efficiency and effectiveness of entire governmental systems. The religious implications of these disturbing habits were equally profound, as many of these kings claimed divine authority for behaviors that horrified even their most devoted subjects. Akhenaten's living mummification was presented as a holy practice that would revolutionize Egyptian religion, while Christian seventh self-harm was justified as necessary spiritual purification. The tension between royal claims of divine right and obviously disturbed behavior created theological crises that reverberated through entire civilization. Foreign relations during the reigns of these disturbed monarchs often became exercises in diplomatic creativity, as ambassadors and visiting dignitaries struggled to maintain international relationships while navigating the dangerous waters of royal madness. Trade agreements were negotiated with kings who might suddenly begin conversations with invisible lunar goddesses, while military alliances had to be maintained with rulers who believed they were made of fragile glass that could shatter at any moment. The impact on royal families was perhaps most tragic of all, as spouses, children, and relatives watched their loved ones descend into madness while being powerless to provide meaningful help. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria spent years of her marriage unable to physically touch her husband, while the children of these disturbed kings grew up in environments where normal family relationships were impossible. The personal cost of royal madness extended far beyond the monarchs themselves to encompass everyone who loved them. Military campaigns conducted under the leadership of these disturbed kings often became surreal affairs that defied conventional understanding of warfare and strategy. Soldiers served under commanders who made tactical decisions based on conversations with the moon, who delayed crucial battles to consult with trees, or who became catatonic in the middle of important campaigns. The fact that some of these kingdoms managed to achieve military success, despite their royal handicaps, speaks to the competence of their subordinate commanders and the resilience of their military institution. The palace architecture and interior design of these kingdoms had to be modified extensively to accommodate royal madness, creating some of the most unusual royal residences in history. Rooms were padded and reinforced to protect glass kings, chambers were designed with special ventilation systems to manage the odors of living mummification, and dining halls were arranged to provide optimal viewing angles for impalement spectacle. These architectural accommodations serve as permanent monuments to the strange intersection of royal privilege and mental illness. The artistic and cultural productions of these kingdoms often reflected the disturbing influence of royal madness, as court painters, musicians, and writers struggled to create works that would please their unstable patrons without offending their peculiar sensibility. Portraits had to be painted of kings who believed themselves to be animals or made of glass, while court musicians composed pieces suitable for lunar serenades and tree conversations. The cultural legacy of these reigns includes some of the most bizarre artistic works in human history. Medical practitioners of these ancient times found themselves in impossible situations when called upon to treat royal patients whose conditions defied contemporary understanding of health and disease. Court physicians had to pretend that glass delusions were real medical conditions requiring treatment, while others were forced to develop techniques for preserving living human tissue to satisfy pharaonic obsessions with mummification. The evolution of medical practice in these courts often took directions that hindered rather than advanced the healing arts. The legal systems of these kingdoms had to develop unprecedented flexibility to function around royal behaviors that often conflicted with their own laws and established precedents. How does a legal system handle a king who commits cannibalism or who makes important legal decisions based on advice from trees? Court lawyers and judges learned to interpret royal madness in ways that preserved the fiction of legitimate governance while protecting society from the worst excesses of their rulers. The religious establishments of these kingdoms faced perhaps the greatest challenges of all, as they struggled to maintain the divine authority of kings whose behavior clearly contradicted religious teachings about righteousness, wisdom, and proper conduct. Priests and religious leaders had to perform theological gymnastics to explain how divinely appointed rulers could engage in practices that their own religions condemned as sinful or evil. The compromise between religious doctrine and political necessity often resulted in corrupted spiritual institutions. The common people of these kingdoms developed their own coping mechanisms for dealing with royal madness, often turning to folk beliefs, underground religious movements, or simply learning to stay as far away from the royal court as possible. Peasants and merchants learned to time their interactions with royal officials to avoid periods when the king's particular madness might influence governmental decisions. The psychological impact on entire populations living under obviously disturbed rulers contributed to social instability and cultural trauma that lasted for generations. The transition periods following the deaths or depositions of these mad kings often revealed the true extent of the damage their reigns had caused to governmental institutions, international relationships, and social structure. Successor monarchs and regency councils faced the enormous task of rebuilding kingdoms that had been shaped by years or decades of accommodation to royal madness. The recovery process often took generations and sometimes proved impossible, leading to the permanent decline or collapse of once mighty empire. Modern psychological analysis of these historical cases provides fascinating insights into the relationship between power and mental health, suggesting that the isolation and unchecked authority of absolute monarchy may have contributed to or exacerbated underlying psychological conditions. The absence of normal social feedback, the constant flattery and deference of courtiers, and the ability to act on any impulse without consequence created environments that were practically designed to nurture and amplify mental illness. The documentation of these royal disturbing habits provides invaluable historical evidence about the limitations of absolute monarchy as a governmental system, and the importance of institutional checks on individual power. These 11 kings serve as case studies in what happens when political systems lack the mechanisms to remove or constrain leaders who have become dangers to themselves and their subjects. Their stories argue powerfully for the development of governmental structures that can function independently of individual personality disorders or mental health crises. The entertainment value of these historical accounts should not overshadow their serious implications for understanding human nature, political power, and the structures of civilization itself. While we may find these stories amusing or shocking from our safe historical distance, they represent real human suffering on a massive scale, as entire populations lived under the rule of individuals whose grip on reality had become dangerously tenuous. As we reflect on these tales of royal madness, We might consider how similar patterns of behavior manifest in contemporary leaders who wield significant power without adequate oversight or accountability. While modern democratic institutions provide better mechanisms for constraining dangerous leadership than existed in these ancient kingdoms, the fundamental human susceptibility to the corrupting influence of unchecked power remains unchanged from these historical examples. The legacy of these 11 disturbed kings extends beyond their individual reigns to influence our contemporary understanding of leadership, mental health, and the structures of political authority. Their stories continue to serve as cautionary tales about the dangers of concentrating too much power in the hands of any individual, regardless of their apparent qualifications or initial stability. The disturbing habits we've explored tonight remind us that power truly does corrupt, and absolute power corrupts, absolutely. Sometimes in ways that defy imagination and challenge our basic assumptions about human nature and civilized society.